Hello YouTubers. In this video we're going to be working on my left rear axle. When I was changing out the springs with the previous video, one of the previous videos, I noticed that I saw some grease splatters around the edge of the axle where the boot meets the axle, so the short side, and it was just barely seeping out. And as you saw in a previous video, I covered that in silicone vulcanized tape, and that fixed the leak. It was no longer leaking, but that didn't fix the problem. So in this video, we're going to be turning the car around, putting it in the air, and we're going to remove the axle, and we're going to replace the boot and put it all back together. And that's what's going to be in this video. Now, for me, I tried to buy a spare axle or a new axle that would go in there, and they are unavailable anywhere in the world. You cannot get an axle for this car. It is, your only option is to buy another car to get the axle out of it, or repair the one you got. So we're going to be repairing the one we got. So the first thing we want to do is get the car in the garage. I want to be on the sun side because it's cold out, and we're going to turn it around and start working on our project. Here's the parts that we need. This is from Saab parts. I guess you can get it from anywhere. It's not a Saab part, doesn't look to be. So this is it. This is our boot. And with 2 pats of grease, it seems. Probably more than enough. Okay, and we got all our clips that we're going to need. Okay, the very first thing you're going to want to do is take your center cap off. For me, I had to jack the car up, pull the wheel off, pop out the center cap, drop everything back down. Once that's done, bolt it back up, put it back so that the car is resting on itself. Then you can loosen the axle bolt, which is a 32 millimeter. Now we're going to put it back in the air, take the wheels back off. What I want to do is to probably move the brake caliper up and out of the way, maybe hook it onto something else. Just, I don't want to pinch any lines, and it's going to have to come out no matter what, or come loose anyway. So let's go ahead and just get the caliper off and hang it up. Okay, the next thing it says to do is to press this inward, but it can only go so far in because the axle's in the differential. So I don't have a press to press this in, but I did have a hammer. And so I just tapped the hammer until it went in. So let me quickly interrupt this part because this is super, super important for you. If you're gonna hammer this axle, you're gonna have to hammer it lightly, or put something inside of that divot and hammer it, because I made the mistake of hammering the axle, and it ended up costing me $150 to have someone fix the threads that I mangled, because the hammer marred and distorted the roundness of the axle. So take my advice and be careful. I would recommend a part like this you can get from Harbor Freight, fairly cheap, and that should do the job. And it's gone in some. I don't think it can go in any further because the axle's in place, but it did move, and so it's not seized into place. So we'll continue on with the rest of the steps. Okay, the next thing it wants us to do is to disconnect the sway bar end link from here with that bolt. That's a 16, and that is a 21 for the shock absorber. So we need to take those 2 bolts off. Okay, now we need to loosen this. This is an E18, and on the other side is an 18 millimeter. So let's just loosen. So the next thing we have to do is remove these clips from here, here, and here. The next thing it says do is disconnect this harness, which we've already disconnected it here, here, and now we need to disconnect it here. Now, I had a devil of a time. So that you don't have a devil of a time, this thing goes on like so, but you got to pull out that blue side. That locks this in place. Once you pull that out, You should be able to push in and release. So the next thing we want to do is remove this control arm. So that's an that's an 18 millimeter there and an E18 over here. So let's get that bolt. Okay, the bolt is out. Knuckle is loose. So the next thing we want to do is get under the car. We're going to follow this bracket here, or trailing arm, and we want these bolts. There, there, and there. There's 4 of them. 18 millimeters. Let's loosen those out, or take those out. Okay, the bolts are out. The arm now moves. You can see the bolt there, where bolt was. So the next thing we want to do is to get this out. In order to get this out, I'm going to tap it with the hammer in the hopes that it releases fully from the hub. I tapped it in, and I can't make it do it one-handed, but she's loose, and I can feel it because it moves. When I have 2 hands, and I can hold this in and pull this down, it moves just fine. Next thing we want to do is get under the car and tap out the CV axle from the differential. So now, in order to get the axle out of the differential, here's where it is. And we need to tap, excuse me, this here. I'm going to use a screwdriver. It says use a brass drift, which is a solid piece of brass, to hit this in order to break it free from the differential. As it just goes in and clicks, and we just want it to pull back out. So I'm gonna rotate this thing around so that the area that I hit is on the bottom. Let me rotate it and pull this, tap this thing out with a hammer and a long screwdriver. Okay, so here's the axle. I pulled it out of the area. I did have to use the screwdriver, just a wedge between here, here, and the bottom down there. Since I had already tapped it loose, it popped right out, and then all I had to do is pull this down while pushing this, while holding this here, allowing the axle to stay in place while the thing pivoted down. Now, I've already tapped that loose. This axle should be ready to pop out. And here she is. All right, you see my quick repair. Now, let's get this to the table, get it set up to disassemble it. Prepared a work surface on my bench. This is just trash bags to help capture whatever grease we're going to have fall out of the CV joints. So let's go get the axle. Here's the axle. Everything's out. Next thing I'm going to do is cut off the wire strap, tie straps that I put on. Get the band clamp underneath here off, and get this clamp here off. Then we should be able to cut the boot away. So let's do that now. I have a trash can right here, and what I'm going to try to do is get this part loose and let everything dump into the trash can, and then clean things up here. So all I did was take a pair of snips, just hold it on here like so, and just grab it. That one's off. Now I need to cut this vulcanized tape off. She's wet, as I would expect. So here's my patch, went around like that. Did pretty well. Good temporary fix, I think. Am I a genius? To be determined. All right, let's cut this clamp here off. That one's off. Next step is to cut the boot. Actually, let's get this one here off and out of our way. Now, let's cut the boot. It's gonna make a mess. Let's get prepared for the mess. Now, I don't wanna cut too deep to scar anything underneath here because I want the surface to be nice and clean. So I'm just gonna cut as delicately as possible. In fact, let me change out the blade. And I'm not gonna dig any further than that. I'm just gonna break it apart. Okay. Actually, we'll just do it right here on the cup side. Oh, sorry, can't see. Okay, so the item is cut, the cup is, there we go, in the trash. There's our liquefied stuff. I don't know if it's a value to see it. It's just full of grease. I'm going to pour it into the trash. I'm going to let it drain for a little bit, and we'll be back once it's finished. So what we got to do now is, this is not going to come out of the cup. The bearings are not going to come out of the cup. So what we have to do is we have to trim back where you see it jutting out, where you see these punch holes. Those punch holes were put into place to retain this so that it won't come out. So we're going to have to get a grinder tool, like a Dremel. I don't have a Dremel. I'll show you what I'll use, and trim that back so that this thing slides right out. So what I want to do now is put something in here to protect it so that when we begin this work, all the shavings that go, all the grinding shavings don't go into the bearings and cause problems down the road. So I'm going to take some paper towels and just shove it down in there. When it's all out of here, I will clean it all. With regards to shaving this, there is no wrong or right way. There is no this amount or it's got to be at least that amount. It's just got to take, you've just got to do it until there's enough material removed so that you can get the bearings out. So in order to do this, I bought this to attach to my drill, and these are grinding points, and that's what I'm going to use. It looks like it would work the same way as a Dremel without having to buy a Dremel. If you got a Dremel, great. If not, this I think is a viable solution. So I'm going to start with one of these points. Only thing I see different is that one's more rounded, that one's more pointed, and obviously that has no point at all. And I don't know which one is the right one, but we're going to start with that one. So what I've done is, so I'm going to pause the video here because this is where I made a crucial mistake in my project. This axle sitting upright ended up being a problem for me downstream. What do I mean by that? As I am going to do, I am going to burr away some of the metal, grind away some of the metal so that I can remove the axle and the bearings away from the cup side. Those grindings found their way down into the bearing, and I ended up having to have somebody professionally take a look at it to make sure I did not ruin the bearings. Now, I had cleaned it out as best I can with tons of brake cleaner, parts cleaner, and then took it to an axle shop and had them take a look at it to make sure that the axle was indeed, the bearings were indeed good. But we're going to get to that part, but I wanted to first tell you, don't do what I did. Hold it down to the side, work from a side perspective. And in fact, there's a guy who has a video on this that did a phenomenal job recording it. And I'm going to link to that down below so that you can see how he did his, and that's how you should do yours. Rope a tie strap, and got the axle sitting in between it. That way the axle is not going anywhere, and I can see where I'm trying to do and knock it out. Now I did say I was going to use the other tip, but I am going to use this tip because I think it can get where I need it to go better than the other one. I did buy a Dremel just in case, so we'll just have to see, but I'm going to try this first. So I've done some burring, if you will, in the area. Don't know that it's enough. Don't know that it's not enough. So let's get this out and see if this piece will lift out. Anyway, I want to be careful. Let me. All right, so it's out. Here's what all I had to remove. Can you see it? So here are the bearings that I wanted to take a moment to show you. As you can see, there's all sorts of debris all over this thing, metal shavings. Anyway, I cleaned it up, like I said, as best I could with all sorts of parts cleaner, and I took it to the CV axle shop, and they said that they put it in their parts washer, they cleaned it up real good, and said that the bearings are just fine, there's nothing wrong with them, and it was ready to go. So it's the next day. I stopped yesterday after I cleaned out the cup of the grease and I cleaned off the bearings as best I could, but there was some debris in there from the shavings, from shaving off the area of the cup side, this side, that left debris down in there, and I was concerned about the bearings. So after I cleaned everything off, I felt some notchiness in the bearing, and I wanted somebody to take a look at it. So I took the unit in to a garage here that I trust, and the two halves, and they looked at the bearings and inspected them and said the bearings are fine. And I said, can you put it in a parts washer, because I don't have one, and just clean it all out, make sure it's free of debris and everything? And they said, sure. And I said, well, while you're at it, can you hammer off the bearing? So I'll show you what that is in one of these corners somewhere. But that bearing just slides off, needs some pressure. So a hammer and a chisel, or a hammer and a screwdriver or something, just to hammer that piece off, it will come off. And it does come off. I went ahead and had them do that. Actually, they used a press. They put this in a press and pushed it out, and I just felt that was the better way to go versus me hammering it while they were inspecting it. The place I took it to was a CV place, and they said everything was fine. I didn't want them to put it back together. I figured I would come back, show you me putting the bearing back on, putting the retaining clip back on, putting the boot back on, and they brought it out to me like this. So I apologize. That was not the intent of this part of the video. We were going to go through it ourselves. I will put a link in the description below to a guy's video of him hammering this off, hammering that bearing off, because that was the only part that we're missing. Hammering that bearing off, putting the boot on, hammering the bearing back on, and putting this back together like as you see it here. It's just one of those things. I wish that wouldn't have happened, but it did. So next thing we need to do is get this back in the car. So what we're going to do here is, actually we need to lift this control arm up out of our way. Out of our way like that. Let's insert our axle back in the hole. All right, I got it sitting there. This is a two-handed job. So all I'm gonna do is push that back in, push this down so that this goes back into there. No rocket science. Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I ended up having problems with the axle by hammering it, and the hammering part was when I went to put it back in. In order to get it into the differential, it takes some effort to get it into the differential. It doesn't want to go back in there. I will say the tip and trick here is to hold it level with the differential. So I ended up having a buddy come over, holding the axle parallel to everything, and tapping it in eventually with a piece of wood, but that's not what I did originally. I tried to do it all myself and hammering it with a metal hammer and making this axle no longer round on the end and tearing up the threads. So ultimately I had to take the axle back out, take it back to the CV shop and have them fix what I had mangled. So the rest of this was putting everything back together in reverse order. Well, I've gone ahead and put everything back together just so that I know what to tell you to do. So the first thing I did was, we obviously had to fix the axle into the shaft, which is where we left off. So I got the axle into the shaft. I took a piece of wood. Do not hit the end of this with a hammer, a metal hammer. Rubber hammer's fine. But you can hit this if the nut is out and a piece of wood there, so you don't mar or distort the roundness of this axle, and it can be distorted with a metal hammer. So hammer this in until the axle goes all the way in inside the seat. Just look at the other side so you know how it's supposed to look, but it's supposed to go flush, and it will go flush. Next thing I had to do was I wanted to we put the extension up, and then we put the axle nut on, just starting it so that it would hold in place. We also had to make sure that this arm here went into that pocket. Not a problem. It all just kind of, as soon as I sat it up, lined that up, everything just kind of went in place. Now without some force, because it doesn't want to just go in there, but it didn't take much force for it to just slip in place. So once I did that, I started that bolt just by putting it in, did not do anything else. That way the suspension didn't want to fall back, get back down. Next thing I did was I lined up these bolts here and got them started. Did not tighten them. Got them started, got that one started. Next thing I did was start the sway bar end link bolt down there that we've already taken out. Started that bolt. Then I started the shock absorber bolt in its place. Next thing I did was I fit this back into place. I then routed my wiring and made my connection here. And what else did I do? Put back on the brake caliper, or put back on the rotor and the brake caliper, and that was it. So after I put in everything, got them all started, and everything was in place, I then tightened this to whatever's on the screen, because I don't remember. I then tightened the upper control arm to whatever's on the screen, because I don't remember. I then tightened the shock absorber to whatever's on the screen, because I don't remember. I then tightened the sway bar end link down there to whatever's on the screen, because I don't remember. And then I put back on the caliper and tightened until it was just tight. It can only go so far. All right, outside of that, that was it. Oh, and then I put the wheel back on the car, set it back quasi on the ground, not all the way on the ground, and tightened it to 204 foot-pounds. That's what that is. That one I do remember because that's the last one I just did. All right, next thing we need to do is put the wheel on the car and take it for a test drive. Okay, everything's back on, everything's torqued to spec. Car's back together. We've already taken it for a test drive. There's no runs, no leaks, no errors. So everything's good. This job is very intricate. You got to be careful with what you're doing. I think the way which I did things, I followed the Saab WIS Manual, WIS, stands for something. I'll put it on the screen. I followed those instructions in taking this apart and putting it back together, and there were no issues. It worked as the plan said, or as the manual said. So I will say everything I did is in the description below. Probably like torque specs are in there, the parts I bought are in there, stuff like that. So be mindful, look down there, look for information. Also, I'll link to the guy who cleaned out his cup and put the boot back together very clearly. I'll put his link down below to that video. So that's it, YouTubers. Everything is done. Excited, everything's good with the car. Now, one thing I want to cover, that part is unobtainium. You cannot get that part. It is not for sale anywhere, used or otherwise. You couldn't pay somebody $10,000 online to buy the part because the part's not for sale. There is no part. The only way you're going to get a part like this, that axle, is to buy another Saab and take the axle out of it. That's the only way. There's not a part for sale. I've checked junkyards, checked just every place I know to check, and I put in a VPN, moved myself to Latvia to try to find that part. Part is not available. So it is what it is. You got to spend the time and fix the one you got. So that's the purpose of this video, is for the few of you that have these cars. But what I showed you is how to fix it. So anyway, YouTubers, if you like the video, like the video.